dad and his younger brother George were placed in a foster home, and his brothers that were older than him had to go to they were in an orphanage. But the cool part about this story is that my Uncle Art, who was 8 at the time, continued to write the social worker. He advocated for him and his brothers to be together at the young age of 8. I don't even know what 8-year-old today could even have that kind of foresight, but he wrote the social worker and, kept telling her to please ask the foster parents that my dad and his brother were with, can you please ask them if they'll take one more? We have to be together. We're a family. Can you just ask them again if they'll take one more brother? We all need to be together. We're a family. And I guess the social worker broke and eventually asked the couple, the elderly German American couple in the late 1930s / early 1940s. So try to imagine that. If they would take in all 6 little Mexican boys. And they said yes. So my dad and his brothers were raised under the same roof um, by a very kind-hearted German American family. And my aunt, who was raised in Mexico by her aunt, was taken care of by her family down there. My grandmother did eventually die. And my uncle, Henry, who was the second in line, remembered that he had a sister. Again, I don't really know all about the details regarding that, but I do know that he knew that he had a sister in Mexico, and he knew that her citizenship would expire if she didn't get back to the States before she turned 18. So he went all the way down to Mexico, didn't speak any Spanish, and found my aunt and drove her all the way back to Pittsburgh. And she was reunited with her brothers, who she had never seen or met. And then she was able to stay with the same foster parents. And so the cool part about that is that they were able to have a bond and a relationship, even though she came into the scene a little later, because she was like 16 or 17, and they were, anywhere from 17 to 24. They continued to foster their relationship and stay in contact with each other from that time on. And so now my dad is living with my aunt, and her daughter is taking care of him and my mom. So, an interesting aside, I suppose.
Did you talk about Tata's life?
My mom was born in Mexico, and she was born in a very I guess you could say a low income home in Mexico. She slept on dirt floors. I remember visiting her hometown and her home and sleeping on dirt floors too when I was very little. But my grandfather decided to move to the city, and he found a job becoming like a custodian at a church in Mexico City. And so then he went back to the little town where my mom was with my grandmother and my uncle, and he got them and brought them into Mexico City. Said he'd found a job, and they were to be like the caretakers of this church, which was in the middle of the city. It was 3 stories, and they were in charge of cleaning every office. And they actually had like little chapels within the church, and then the one big sanctuary. And they had to go to the floor, like the market, picture like an open air market where they sold fresh flowers. And every Saturday there was a wedding, and they would string these flowers and just make these beautiful decorations for the sanctuary for every wedding. And then eventually, on top of their cleaning responsibilities, they lived at the church. And my grandmother, I remember, eventually like had her own like Bible she sold Bibles every Sunday outside of the sanctuary doors. She'd have these little cabinets and they'd be full of different kinds of Bibles, and people would come and she would sell them to the different congregation members. And she saved up all of her money from selling these Bibles and bought her first home. I don't even remember when. I do remember the home. I just don't remember exactly how old she was when she did that. But she bought one home and then she bought another home, and she rented a home. I mean, she took off really, which is very impressive because her humble beginnings were pretty humble. But I guess she just had that desire and innate ability to, that business savvy, that she knew how to make money and then save it and then invest it, and then she knew how to get money back, which is pretty impressive, I will say. So that's my mom's family, and I already talked about my dad's family. And they took them down into Mexico, and my uncle and my dad had such a blast setting them off. But then, the police in Mexico did not like that, so that was kind of rough. But it is one of my most favorite, cherished childhood memories, is taking a road trip with my favorite aunt and uncle and my parents and my brother, driving to Mexico. And then we did another road trip similar, but we flew to Oklahoma and visited my uncle and then drove from there. So those are some like highlights. Being bilingual has been great. I also remember my K through 8 school was didn't offer any like foreign language or world language classes, but I was able to test out of Spanish 1. I actually was given an option. I took a test at the high school before I was to be a freshman, and they said, well, this is what your score was. Do you want to take Spanish 2 or Spanish 3? So I automatically passed out of Spanish 1, and I took Spanish 2 because I knew I did not have a strong sense of conjugating the verbs, even though I knew a lot of vocabulary words. So I thought that was a good fit for me. Was I bullied as a child? Yes. People didn't really know, I guess, how to react to someone that looked different from them. And like I said, I was the only one. And I think, too, growing up, like on television, there weren't very many people that looked like me. So I really thought I could only aspire to be Maria on Sesame Street. And I still sometimes think about that, because Sesame Street's pretty cool. Maybe I miss my calling. Anyway, let's see. So I guess the other part about like having parents that are, my dad was born here, but he was raised in a foster home, so he did not have a lot of, he didn't learn a lot of life skills from his foster parents. And then my mom, being born and raised in Mexico, really didn't know a lot of things that, people might learn when they're raised here and their parents have been here like generationally. So I think that it's not bad or good. It just made my childhood a little bit different. I'm trying to think of like different ways. Like I know for a fact when I went to high school, my parents didn't advocate for me to go to like AP classes or anything like that. They just had me in the normal college prep courses, and that turned out fine. But I do wonder like what that could have been like if I had had those opportunities, but my parents just didn't know. They didn't know what they didn't know. So there's that. Little things like that, I guess, were kind of different for me. But looking back, I don't know that I would ask for it to be changed. I think that I appreciate my parents more for the fact that I know they tried really hard to raise me the best they could. And I will always and forever be grateful for my mom making me read those boring Mexican history books in Spanish to her. Um, so yeah, I mean, I'm my job now is working with a lot of migrant students at a local high school, and the fact that I speak Spanish and I look like the students, I think it really gives me an advantage. I feel like they look at me, they know they can trust me, and they're able to share a lot of their personal challenges with me and know that I can hold a safe space for them and I understand what they're saying, but also partly when they talk about like their homelands or Latin America, you know, I can let them know that I've been to Mexico many times and we can talk about the culture and that I do to a degree understand what they're referring to. So I think that's helpful. I know that's not really about my childhood, but I thought I would just put in that little perk.
Um, did you talk about? I don't know. Did you talk about Toe's life and go over those details?
So my dad
He
was
a boxer.
he wasn't. My dad was one of 7 children, born to two Mexican individuals from Mexico. They came here at different times in their lives, but they fell in love. And my dad was the, I guess, fifth in line. They were all brothers. He had a younger brother after that, and then the youngest, the seventh child born to my grandparents, was a little girl. And when my grandmother was pregnant, she knew that she had cancer. So she was 32 and she wanted to die in Mexico, in her hometown. So she made the decision to take my aunt after she was born to Mexico and leave. She wanted her daughter to be raised by her relatives in Mexico, but unfortunately she couldn't take all her sons, so she left her 6 boys behind with her husband. Unfortunately, her husband, my grandfather, had an alcohol addiction and was unable to care for my dad and all of his brothers. So social services got wind of that very quickly, and they placed my dad and his younger brother George in a foster home because they were the youngest, and the other brothers were placed.
Action.
Hi, my name is Lisa Williams, and I am first generation immigrant on my mother's side and second generation on my father's side. My dad's parents came to the United States from Mexico, and he was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My mother was born and raised in Mexico, and my dad actually met her in Mexico and they got married, and then he brought her here to the States. So I have 2 Mexican parents, but their stories are slightly different. And I was raised kind of biculturally. When my mom had me, she did not know any English at all. So she spoke to me only in Spanish. However, when my brother, who is 3 years younger than I am, was born, my mom decided that she wanted to learn English. And so she kind of stopped speaking Spanish at home. However, because her parents lived in Mexico, she took my brother and I to Mexico uh, kind of often, like every other summer for summer vacations. My dad was a teacher, and so he would work as a someone that painted houses in his summer vacations, and my mom would take my brother and I back to her homeland, and we would visit my grandparents and my uncle and my cousins. So I'm closer to the relatives that are in Mexico that are on my mom's side, because my mother never really took us to see relatives on my dad's side. Now, when my dad went on vacations with us, which also happened, then we saw some people on his side as well. Um, so I will say that growing up speaking kind of sort of two different languages had a lot of advantages, but also a lot of challenges, right? Because I was raised in a community that was primarily white and Caucasian. So there were very few Hispanics growing up. I went to a school that was K through 8, and I think I was the only Mexican student there from K through 8. Um, and I know when I was in kindergarten, my kindergarten teacher had a conference with my parents, and one of her biggest concerns for them was that I didn't know the word for underarm in English. She was thinking that I needed to really work on that. I guess because I said axilla, she asked the class, "Who knows what this is?" And I raised my hand enthusiastically, as any 5-year-old would, and I said axilla, and she was like, "No, it's underarm." But she wasn't taking into consideration that I would probably eventually learn English and the English word for underarm, but that was like a big concern of hers. Um, anyway, so moving forward, my parents, I mean, I guess my mom didn't pay that much attention to her because she always made me read these Mexican history books. I don't know why. I guess she did the best she could, right? But like she didn't know any other kind of like children's classics. So she had me reading Mexican history books in Spanish before I went to bed. And I remember reading them on her bed and thinking, these are so incredibly boring. Like, oh my gosh, I do not want to read these. But now that I am one of very few Spanish speaking social workers in the state of Delaware, I will say, thank you, Mom. Respect. Um, I also was one who always wanted to learn the language, so I was, very inquisitive. I remember wanting to write to my grandparents in Spanish, so I'd ask my mom, like, how do you say this in Spanish? How do you say that in Spanish? And she would always say, in Spanish, it's exactly what it sounds. How it sounds like you spell it, that's how it's spelled. Um, so I enjoyed that, and I enjoyed talking to my grandparents in Spanish when I visited them. Um, Another big advantage to going or to like growing up in a bilingual, bicultural household is that besides the frequent trips to Mexico, a lot of them were by plane. But fun fact, we actually took two like road trips to Mexico. One was from Pittsburgh, and it was me and my favorite aunt and her husband, my uncle, and then my parents and my brother. And we drove this van all the way from Pittsburgh, all the way to, like, of course, through the states. We went to Oklahoma. We visited my Uncle Henry and his family. And I remember it was around the 4th of July. So we set off these fireworks, and my dad and my uncle bought these fireworks in Oklahoma, and they drove them across the border. So I don't know how they did that. I'm sure if that, when they crossed the border, if someone had found the fireworks in the van, they would have gone in big trouble, or they probably would have been confiscated. But for some weird reason, they did not. And they took them down into Mexico. And anything else.
I think we're good.